Across the 19th and 20th centuries, the field of psychology developed alongside the burgeoning artistic genres of horror and science fiction. As it did, the latter began to feature the idea of monsters that come from dreams. Early examples include Edgar Allan Poe's Dreamland from 1844 and H.P. Lovecraft's Dream Quest of the Unknown Kadath from 1927. These would later give way to films such as 1956's Forbidden Planet, in which monsters from the id arise from the dreams of the unconscious and attack the protagonists.
Monsters from the id. Huh? Monsters from the subconscious.
As well as the 1959 Twilight Zone episode Perchance to Dream, in which the protagonist is killed by phantasms from his nightmares. We're going to build on this idea of monsters that inhabit dreams in the adventure that we're going to sketch out today. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and today we're going to discuss the Ravenloft Domain of Dread, known as the Nightmare Lands. This is a very old Ravenloft Domain of Dread, going back to the very first edition of the campaign setting, and I was happy to see it featured in the 5th edition Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. As with all of my Ravenloft videos, we're going to go over what the Domain of Dread is, cover a few cultural inspirations that help us get an imaginative grip on the domain, and then sketch out an adventure. In this case, the adventure will take PCs up from levels 8 through levels 14. That is, they will complete the adventure at level 14 and level up to 15 at the end, and it will occur across 3 acts. So let's get started. What are the Nightmare Lands? Well, any who sleep might close their eyes and become forever trapped in the Nightmare Lands, a phantasmagoric realm whose features shift endlessly. Those who visit and escape speak of malicious wildernesses, the empty city called Nod, and uncountable drifting spheres, each containing a stranger's unending nightmare. Insidious entities known as the Nightmare Court rule the domain. None know how many members compose the court, but they include the tragically graceful Ghost Dancer, the tomb-bound Hypnos, the Witch Malonia, the trickster Morpheus, and the embodiment of terror known as the Nightmare Man. These beings are artisans of nightmares, visiting terrors upon any whose sleeping minds brush against the domain. Now, if you read the full description of the Nightmare Lands, you may notice that there's a kind of descriptive tension in it. On one hand, we're told that the Nightmare Court are these predatory entities that can travel into anyone's dreams and haunt them. But on the other hand, we're told that all of the Nightmare Court are manifestations of a psychic named Carolyn Dinwiddie who's dreaming them into existence. This, of course, raises a question: who exactly is the Dark Lord of the Nightmare Lands? Who exactly are the true villains here? Is it the Nightmare Court, or is it this child, Carolyn Dinwiddie? I don't think it's a problem, and I think it's cool that the entry leaves it open to the reader and to the DM's interpretation. But it's worth noting that if you want to set an adventure in the Nightmare Lands, you might want to choose beforehand which to emphasize. And, as we'll see, in our adventure, we're going to emphasize the villainy of the Nightmare Court, not of the child Carolyn Dinwiddie. Now, speaking of the Nightmare Court, let's talk about some media influences that we can use to get an imaginative grip on what types of creatures these are exactly. The first influence on which we will draw is the 1984 film Nightmare on Elm Street by Wes Craven. I'm of course speaking of the character of Freddy Kreuger, and we will want to draw on the way that Freddy maniacally tortures his victims. He not only appears in their dreams, but he takes advantage of what his victims fear, and he torments them with glee, and we'll want to copy this personality in characterizing at least some of the Nightmare Court's members. And in the same way that Freddy can visit anyone while they're sleeping, although he follows certain rules about mainly haunting the dreams of children and youths, we too will have the Nightmare Court imbued with this capacity to travel to anyone's dreams and hurt them there. The second source of inspiration for the Nightmare Court comes from the 2001 film 13 Ghosts. This is produced by Dark Castle Entertainment, and I'm thinking in particular of the way in which the 13 Ghosts fit into a zodiac, or an evil dark zodiac. The inclusion of the Dark Zodiac as a plot device does something to the eponymous 13 Ghosts. It makes it so that they're not just a random assemblage of specters, they're not just some group of ghosts. Instead, they are symbols. They have some kind of cosmic or law-like significance. They fit into some natural division into the spectral realm. And we're going to want to do that with the Nightmare Court also. We'll want to say that the Nightmare Court are not just a group of dream monsters. They're not just a random gaggle of villains. They are, in fact, like zodiacal signs, symbols. They make up a natural division amongst the realms of nightmares, and we'll want to communicate that early on in our adventure. As for the adventure and its plot, there are a couple of movies and a board game that we're going to draw upon. The first is Dreamscape from 1984. This is admittedly not a very good film. I cannot, in complete honesty, recommend it as an entertaining watch. However, there are a couple of scenes in it, really fantastical scenes of what a dreamscape might look like, which are actually quite scary and imaginatively nightmarish. The plot involves a psychic, played by Dennis Quaid, getting recruited into a scientific project involving the exploration of dreams. Our protagonist discovers that an innocent child is being tortured by some kind of monster in the child's dreams, and so he takes it upon himself to enter the child's dreams and save him from the monster. The plot is very close to the adventure that we're going to sketch out, and if you sit down and watch Dreamscape, you're going to think to yourself, wow, that's kind of a neat plot. I really wish someone were to sit down and remake this film, but with better ideas. And that brings us to the 2000 film The Cell. The Cell is what you get if someone sits down and then remakes Dreamscape but with better ideas. In The Cell, a detective alongside a clinical psychologist are tasked with the quest of entering a serial killer's unconscious mind in order to find out where he hid one of his victims. As the protagonists explore the demented landscape, which is the unconscious mind of the serial killer, we are treated to a lot of horrific and psychedelic imagery. The film, of course, does have some shortcomings, but I do recommend it, especially when it comes to thinking about the plot and the nature of our adventure in the Nightmare Lands. Finally, there's the board game Stuffed Fables from 2018. This is a much more wholesome take on the very same plot. Here, there's a poor innocent child who has fallen asleep, and each of the players of the board game have a stuffed animal avatar, a wholesome plush creature that's going to go into the mind of the child and save the child from all kinds of nightmare creatures. Again, it's the very same plot as before. You've got a group of adventurers that are going into an innocent person's mind in order to defeat nightmarish monsters. Finally, when it comes to imagery and general imaginative inspiration for what the dreamscape could be like or what the Nightmare Lands could be like, there are a few sources to recommend. I definitely recommend the 2021 stop-motion animation film Mad God by Phil Tippett. This film took about 30 years to make, and it is absolutely astounding in its nightmarish imagery. There are a couple of scenes from this film which we will draw upon in sketching out our adventure. There's also the 2005 stop-motion animation film Svetlanos, or Torchbearer. The film is directed by Vaclav Svankmajer. He is the son of Jan Svankmajer. And the monsters from that stop-motion animation film we are going to lift and put in our adventure as well. I also recommend the famous right panel of the 1505 painting by Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights. I advise taking a few pieces of this panel and rehearsing some descriptions of them so that you can plop them into the battles in our adventure. There's also a couple of paintings by Zdzislaw Beksinski that we're going to take. They were painted in the later part of the 20th century but don't have titles. One of them in particular is going to be useful in imagining the Ghost Dancer. And finally, for general inspiration, you may want to look at the 1995 second edition Ravenloft box set supplement, The Nightmare Lands. That's right, TSR actually released a whole supplement on this otherwise meagerly described Domain of Dread. The adventures and the bits of lore about the Nightmare Lands and the Nightmare Court are pretty interesting, but I don't think you need to cleave to them in order to run a good adventure in the Nightmare Lands. Anyway, having covered some media to help us get an imaginative grip on the domain of the Nightmare Lands, let's sketch out our adventure. Our adventure takes place across only 3 acts, yet it will take adventurers from levels 8 up to level 15. The first act will take adventurers from levels 8 to 9, the second act will take adventurers from 9 to 12, and the third act will take PCs from 12 to 15. In the first act, PCs will wake up from a shared nightmare, and then be consulted about the case of Carolyn Dinwiddie before entering her dreams. In the second act, PCs will fight one half of the Nightmare Court, specifically Morpheus, the Rainbow Serpent, and Malonia. And then in the third act, the PCs will fight the other half of the Nightmare Court, specifically Hypnos, the Ghost Dancer, and the Nightmare Man. After that, we will have a dramatic narrative resolution, and the adventure will come to a close. Now, this adventure has a background which is important to the story. The PCs have been hired by a doctor, Dr. Harold Dinwiddie, to assist in the treatment and diagnosis of a malady contracted by his daughter. His daughter is Carolyn Dinwiddie. The PCs, therefore, had to travel quite a distance to a village called Nodsborough. The adventure stipulates that by the time the PCs arrive in Nodsborough, it's time for them to turn in, and so they check in at an inn before calling it a night. That's when our adventure begins. In Act 1, at level 8, PCs begin in their common room at an inn. They each have a little bed, but the beds are located together in one single room. It seems as though the PCs are just about to start a long rest, but in point of fact, they are already asleep and they are having a common nightmare. The windows and door of the room immediately burst open and begin to flood with inky black, ice-cold water. Out of the water arise a pair of Gloomstalkers who attack the PCs. You could throw in another Gloomstalker or two to make it interesting, but once the PCs defeat the Gloomstalkers, they are then attacked by 3 members of the Nightmare Court. We'll talk about their statistics later in this adventure. And it is almost a mathematical certainty that those members of the Nightmare Court will bring the PCs down to 0 hit points in an effective TPK. This is why we have the Gloomstalkers up front, by the way. This initial battle ends on a rather steep narrative downbeat, and so we want the PCs to have some victories, at least in the first part of this battle. When the PCs have been defeated, they wake up screaming in their beds at the same time. They've all been having the same nightmare. It was only a dream, and in fact, they have just accrued the benefits of a long rest. As they wake up, they discover it's morning, and it's time to meet their appointment with Dr. Harold Dinwiddie. Before they leave, I would roll 1 hit die for each of the PCs and subtract the amount rolled from their hit points. I would say that the PCs each have 1 mark, 1 scar from their nightmarish battle still on their bodies. It should appear that something which struck them in their nightmare has somehow harmed them in real life. Mysterious. Now, if any of your PCs don't actually sleep or they don't need to sleep, that's okay. Just say that instead of falling asleep, that particular PC got lost in a reverie or high-intensity daydream. They zoned out, so to speak, and suddenly got caught in the nightmarish hallucinatory fantasy that ensued. Once the PCs have breakfast and confer with each other and make their way over to Dr. Dinwiddie's office, he is happy to see them. He introduces Dr. Rudolf van Richten, who has erstwhile arrived to help. Dr. Dinwiddie tells the PCs that a number of children from the village have all died due to a mysterious malady. They begin to have nightmares. Those nightmares get more and more intense. The children often wake up with injuries that they did not have when they went to sleep, and then they die. In each case, when a children dies, they have a look of terror on their face. Dinwiddie explains that he's a medical doctor and could not find anything wrong with the children other than the mysterious injuries that would show up in the morning. Once his own daughter Carolyn seemed to contract the illness, moreover, Dr. Dinwiddie explains how he called Dr. Van Richten to help. When Van Richten has a chance to speak, he's going to address the PCs, asking them where they stayed the night and whether they had nightmares, and if so, what they saw in the nightmares. He will take studious notes and look at the PCs as they recount what battle they had at the very beginning of the adventure. Once he's heard their account, he's going to nod gravely and confirm that this can only be the work of the Dark Oneiroi, the evil Zodiac of the dream world, otherwise known as the Nightmare Court. He will then produce an old tome called The Phantasmal Zodiac and flip open to a page that charts their waxing and waning presences in the terrified unconscious of sleepers. Van Richten explains that Carolyn Dinwiddie is undoubtedly haunted by the Nightmare Court, and she will surely die unless something is done. Fortunately, he adds, something can be done. He tells the PCs that it's possible to drive out the Nightmare Court if they use a specific ritual which he has just finished preparing. The ritual will allow the PCs to travel into the dreams of Carolyn Dinwiddie and fight the Nightmare Court there, 1 member at a time. Once they are all defeated, the Nightmare Court will leave not only Carolyn's mind, but the minds of all others in Nodsborough, and the village should be safe, at least for a time. Van Richten warns, however, that if the PCs die in Carolyn's dreams, they will die in real life. This is the main quest for this adventure. Now, on the topic of resting once the PCs are inside of Carolyn's dreams, let's say that Van Richten gives the PCs 3 or maybe 4 uses of a replenishment incantation. If all the PCs agree, they can call out to Van Richten, and assuming they're not in combat, Van Richten can just confer onto them the effects of a long rest. This will allow us to give the PCs access to the long rest mechanic, even though they're in a dream and on a limited time scale. It also allows us to limit it, and it also allows us to avoid complications of falling asleep inside someone's dreams while they're asleep and what that means. Short rests, we can say, will work as normal. Now, assuming the PCs take the quest, they level up to 9, and we proceed to Act 2. Act 2 is divided into 3 parts: the PC's confrontation with Morpheus, the PC's confrontation with the Rainbow Serpent, and the PC's confrontation with Malonja. Each one is quite different. We begin with the confrontation with Morpheus. I would say that visually, Morpheus looks like Tim Curry's Darkness character from the movie Legend, and he has the statistics of a nightmare shepherd from Mythic Odysseys of Theros. Furthermore, let's say that at the top of every round, or maybe on initiative count 20 of every round, the terrain will suddenly change, and the PCs will find themselves falling 1d6 times 10 feet. They will suddenly find themselves in a different place, falling, and then hit the ground, then fight. Then find themselves in a different place, and then fall and hit the ground, and then fight. And then suddenly find themselves falling in a different place, and fall and hit the ground, and then fight. Each time the scenery changes, you might want to describe some other thing from Hieronymus Bosch's Hell triptych from the Garden of Earthly Delights. This fight should be chaotic, PCs should be slightly frustrated, not the players being frustrated, but the PCs being frustrated, at the fact that they keep no constant position on the battlefield. It should also make it feel really good when they finally kill Morpheus. And when they do, they level up to 10 and suddenly find themselves in a different place to confront the Rainbow Serpent. The Rainbow Serpent resides in a place called the Park Primeval, a tangled, swampy forest that's full of all kinds of crawling creatures. And I think one thing that's good to cultivate here is the fear of creepy crawly things getting on you, the fear of contamination by small animals, the fear of snakes and spiders and Halloween creatures. And to that effect, we're going to use the map of Slither Swamp from Waterdeep Dungeon of the Mad Mage. You can just run the dungeon as is, but I would flavor the bullywugs and the nagas as being obsessed with fleas and other parasites that are on them. I would also say that with every physical interaction, whether it's an attack or even just a friendly interaction, PCs will find themselves covered anew with bugs and serpents and gross things. As for the Rainbow Serpent itself, I think that you could have it show up whenever seems to be opportune. It could be at the boneyard that's in the Slither Swamp, it could be at the ruins of Slither Swamp, or it could be towards the tunnel at the southern end of Slither Swamp. For the Rainbow Serpent statistics, I would use the statistics of a corrupted shark from Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep. Just change its swim speed to a flying speed, give it hover, and also give it 3 uses of legendary resistance, and 3 uses of legendary actions which are restricted to moving and attacking. I imagine the Rainbow Serpent looking like a huge cadaverous pale worm, like in The Lair of the White Worm by Ken Russell. And maybe as it moves, it leaves a rainbow-colored trace, or tracers, or trails. If and when the PCs defeat the Rainbow Serpent, they level up to 11, and then find themselves in another phantasmagoric place in the Nightmare Lands. In this case, it's the Ghettos of Nod, a collection of dreary, dilapidated, sagging, and leaning buildings, all abandoned and run down. I imagine tall buildings as they're depicted in Fritz Lang's Metropolis or the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, some German expressionist thing. Rather than using a dungeon map, we're going to let the Ghettos of Nod be an arena for a boss fight. The boss fight is with Melonia, and Melonia is going to be the combination of 3 creatures, actually. Her head is going to have the statistics of a Morkoth, except for the fact that it has a flying speed with hover instead of a swimming speed. And each of Melonia's hands are going to have the statistics of a living Bigby's hand from Rime of the Frost Maiden. Together, her head and her hands are going to float about, each one as a separate creature, and attack the PCs. Only after all 3 have been destroyed will Melonia be defeated. This is kind of similar to certain boss fights from older video games, like Mega Man X, where you have 2 hands and a head that you're fighting. And when it comes to what the Ghettos of Nod look like, you might want to take a look at 45 minutes into that film Mad God, and just look at that city that's there. Once the PCs defeat Melonia, they level up to 12, and we proceed to Act 3. At the start of Act 3, the PCs find themselves in an inky black void, kind of like maybe the psychic void that Eleven steps into in Season 1 from Stranger Things. Or the void into which Scarlett Johansson leads victims in Under the Skin. There, in that void, the PCs meet Carolyn Dinwiddie. She's in a little dress, her hair is done in pigtails, and she looks very frightened. She thanks the PCs for helping, but warns that the worst is yet to come. She mentions fears of being trapped, of being laughed at, and memories of something horrible. She pleads with the PCs to keep fighting and to save her before she fades into the dark, and then the PCs find themselves in yet another phantasmagoric place. That place is the Spire of Sleep, the lair of Hypnos. Now, Hypnos is represented as a man with a monocle trapped in a transparent diamond-like coffin. Canonically, from 2nd edition, he presides over nightmares that have to do with failure and humiliation, but because of his nature, I would want to associate him also with the nightmares associated with being trapped and drowning and being entombed. Now, for the Spire of Sleep, we're going to use the map of the obstacle course from Dungeon of the Mad Mage. As we do so, we're going to borrow a lot of imagery, including the monsters, from that film Svetlonos. I would change almost all of the monsters so that they look like those weird, eerie, armless statue things. Those things from the film. And I would also say that if the PCs get close enough, they can hear a faint, plaintive, desperate whisper coming from each of the stone statues. As though someone is trapped inside the statue, suffering, wishing that they could get free, and helpless to the violence that the statue is wreaking on their behalf with their life force. Thus, you could make every monster an embodiment of the fear of claustrophobia or being buried alive. As for Hypnos himself, he can, like the Rainbow Serpent, show up on this map whenever it seems to be opportune. Indeed, you might substitute his coffin for the one that contains a vampire on this map. You might also consider replacing the Death Tyrant with Hypnos. Whenever the PCs fight him, use the statistics for a Death Embrace from Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep. Instead of petrifying PCs, moreover, let's say that Hypnos entombs them in diamond coffins, just like the one he's entombed in. Treatment and cures can be the same, but I just like this flavor. If a single Death's Embrace is not sufficiently challenging, moreover, you could give Hypnos a couple of Gloomstalker minions. When the PCs defeat Hypnos, they level up to 13, and they proceed to the next phantasmagoric area of the Nightmare Lands, the Theatre Macabre, home of the Ghost Dancer. Now for this encounter, I really like the idea that the PCs appear on stage before a full audience. The audience includes all kinds of people that the PCs have regarded as authority figures, or heroes, or people they've looked up to, everyone from their parents to the leaders of a city that they had served, everyone. And they are all laughing at, mocking, and showing disappointment in the PCs. The PCs, meanwhile, still have all of their armor and their equipment, but all of their clothing and all of their armor has been rendered transparent. Thus, we are reenacting that famous classic nightmare where you find yourself naked on stage, unprepared for an event for which you are late, and authority figures are disapproving of you. This is the Theatre Macabre, and this is the lair of the Ghost Dancer who soon appears. For the Ghost Dancer, I would use something like a Conclave Dryad from the Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica, making sure to max out its hit points, give it legendary resistance, and give it a few legendary actions, one of which is to heal itself for at least 20 hit points. This is a rather simple battle, but it's a really fun role-playing encounter. You could ask your players, who is it exactly that your PC would see in the audience? What are they saying to make fun of them? And of course, what is your PC's response to all of this? If you're playing with a system that has stress damage or sanity damage or something similar to that, this would be a good way to dish out some of that damage. And when the PCs defeat the Ghost Dancer, they level up to 14 and face the last encounter in the Nightmare Lands, the final arch-member of the Nightmare Court, the Nightmare Man. Now for this last encounter in the Nightmare Lands, I would run 4 sections from the Netherdeep in Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep. Specifically, we will run N2, N3, N5, and N19. After that, the PCs will square off with the Nightmare Man himself. Now, in each of the dreams, of course, we will change the description of ruidium to just being something like blood. We can say that this spiky, congealing, spreading red substance is a nightmarish representation of blood, and not the whole ruidium, moon of Ruidius thing. For area N2, we're going to change the scene slightly so that it's a memory of Carolyn's parents being eaten by vampires. You could use a pair of vampire spawn, or maybe a vampire spawn and a Nosferatu, or maybe 2 Nosferatu. You can adjust the difficulty that way. The fantasy is otherwise resolved in the same way, however. Obviously, in each of these fantasies, you're going to replace the name Alexian with the name Carolyn, and make similar changes there too. For area N3, we're going to change it so that it is a memory of Carolyn's grandmother, that is Dr. Dinwiddie's wife, dying in a hunting accident. N5 is going to contain the most important changes. For N5, we're going to say that the 3 ghostly women represent 3 ladies that Carolyn ran away from home to when she was trying to escape her grandfather's temper. As the PCs solve this fantasy, they will realize that those 3 women were slain by Carolyn's grandfather. Carolyn's grandfather committed murder. He killed those 3 women, and the PCs discover it here. That's what Carolyn is so traumatized about. That's what she's afraid of. That is the source of her deepest nightmares. Big, shocking reveal, and if the players are slow to pick up on this, you can really hammer it home by having Carolyn herself appear after the PCs solve the fantasy and confirm it. After that, run Area 19, the Chamber of Grasping Hands. You don't need to change anything, it's just so creepy and very appropriate for a nightmare realm. And then finally, having faced all that, the PCs have a battle with the Nightmare Man. I would give him the statistics for a Nightwalker. I know they're CR20, but I've had 13th level PCs lay waste to a Nightwalker before. I don't think it's too tough. In addition, I would describe the Nightmare Man as first being a tall, slender man-like creature in a cloak that obscures his features, and then, at the start of the battle, he throws off the cloak to reveal that he's some kind of alien spider-like creature, like the entity from Dead by Daylight or something. Once the PCs defeat the Nightmare Man, there is a welcoming flash of light and warmth, and the PCs suddenly find themselves standing around Carolyn's bed as she wakes up. At that moment, Dr. Van Richten and Dr. Dinwiddie will address the PCs, and here the PCs have the opportunity not only to confirm that they have saved Carolyn, but to indict Dr. Dinwiddie for his crimes. In so doing, the PCs escape from the Nightmare Lands, save others from its depths, and save the day. So that's our adventure in the Nightmare Lands. What did you think? Are there any ways that you would customize it to make it feel more psychological? Would you have included more of the canonical lore from 2nd edition Ravenloft? And what about this idea that Carolyn herself has done something horrific and that she's the true Dark Lord? How would you have adapted that into the adventure? Anyway, thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to do all the internet things. Click like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the bell icon if you want notifications for updates on this channel. And thanks very much.